Hi, my name is Heather Bieber, and I'm going to be talking about crime criminalization and punishment, which is the topic that we covered for this week. And the different readings and stuff have covered topics like classification of crime, crime and madness, supermax prisons, rural criminality, Tlingit societies, the end of apartheid, and historical problems. And so, what I'm going to start off with first is crime classification. And really the way this kind of came about and the way that people were deciding to study criminology was there was a transformation of capitalism in 19th century Europe. And with this spurred not only different dangerous classes but also powerless groups. So there's this juxtaposition between dangerous classes and the powerless groups, and they're trying to decide amongst themselves an endless redefining of what exactly this crime was, how it could be classified. And especially after the Cold War, there was this democratic governance that kind of came about more. So when it was changing into more democratic governance, you can imagine just how it became perhaps more liberal, or how people were trying to put people away for different sorts of crimes that they hadn't before. And another thing is that there's a start of the privatization of economic resources, or an increase. And so for things, crimes like theft and bandits and this sort of thing, the way that crime was going to be determined had a lot to do with this change in government, and also different, and how economic resources were privatized. So we would ask ourselves the questions back then: who are the real bad guys? And how are we going to be able to determine what is what kind of crime with this transformation of capitalism, which is kind of what's happening right now in the 21st century. There's a transformation of capitalism occurring, which I think is going to be making it harder in the long run to classify capitalism and crime. So Linger, next writer, is talking about crime and madness, and he uses a specific instance of this thing called briga, which in translation is a fatal bar or street fight. And what's interesting is that the way that it ties in with these people's way of life, social, moral, and physical factors are kind of threatened. But he was able to get a lot of information from locals, and a lot of researchers hadn't done this before. They were able to talk to locals and get a really good idea and an interpretation of just why these brigas were important to the society and what they reflected. So a lot of times when he would ask the different locals about brigas, they would know somebody personally, or they would be personally involved in a briga before. And they kind of take a dramatic, or even sometimes a humorous look back to kind of get away from fact that it's kind of an anxious thing and that it's pretty common, but it seems that everybody has a story involving this. And what I think it is actually a reflection of different social, moral, and physical factors of the society. And of course, there were usually substances involved with these brigas, so drugs and alcohol. And a story specifically is the boy and the stoned man, where the stoned man, he was really out of it. And the boy said something that he was not intending to be offensive or create this problem, but it happened to, and the stone man was kind of trying to attack this boy, and it was obvious the boy didn't want any part of it, so he was able to escape. And unfortunately, the interpretation that the people had of this is this boy was very lucky, because a lot of times this is where the person dies. So it could also be showing that there's a change in the times, where there's the older generation that is wanting more of this kind of briga, or they don't really care if they get into street fights or who gets hurt or not. But the younger boy was able to kind of smart his way out of it and wasn't hurt in the process. So I'm very glad for that, and I think it is actually a positive reflection of the current state of these people. So another topic by Rhodes, he wrote about the super maximum prisons, which is really based on social exclusion in all forms, which I think could be one of the very worst tortures. Kind of an indirect torture, but in a sense it's really terrible because it's 23 hours that you're completely solitarily confined. You have limited choices throughout your day, if any. And that 1 hour that you're not in your little bedroom, you're taking a shower or just exercising to blow off steam, or you're talking amongst the prisoners. But this is only, a short, a limited time. And the talking amongst the prisoners is kind of an outlet that he was writing about. What I found to be the most interesting because of the different conversations they had, the relationships that they could make with the other prisoners, and the way that they could distract themselves from their mental state, which I feel like in a prison, of course, people are not going to be happy, they're going to be lonely, they're going to be sad, and they're probably going to be regretful of their life decisions. But should their mental state dwindle and decrease and get worse? Should they become crazy? Is it fair? Is this part of the punishment, or it's just a result of the preceding punishment, which is the social exclusion? But I don't believe that they should have this environment where these mental disorders are able to be created, because that's more instability, and that's a way that could even make it harder for people to take control of these prisoners. I'm guessing even things like schizophrenia could arise, or hallucinations, because if you don't have a person to interact with, you will make up your own to stay sane, because we're very social creatures. So I am pretty against these super maximum prisons, and I think there's a way that they can be changed that could be more moral, and more human rights could be involved. And the next topic is Frierson, and she is talking about rural criminality. And she specifically looked at a Russian village at the end of the 19th century. And there is this concept called samosud, which means self-judging. And people were committing really terrible murders, all sorts of things. But they had this customary law where they could judge themselves and say, okay, maybe in this instance it was bad, but in this one it's not. Because they really value this power that they have in this small community as a concept that has been held even at the end of this century, where there's an absence of a system for conflict resolve that the people really have power over. So that's where this concept of samosud comes around. So there's a lot of regional variation between the different Russian villages, but the idea is kind of all the same, where they can create their law. And a really interesting case that I found that is a modern case, which is kind of based on a true story as far as I know. It was a movie that was released this last year that took place in Murmansk, or someplace like right above St. Petersburg, and it was a village. The movie is called Leviathan, and it has a lot to do with crime and punishment, this sort of topic. But there's this modern corruption that's taking place where, in this village specifically, I'm not sure about other places or bigger places, however, the idea is this guy, he built his house on the land that was owned by this powerful businessman lawyer. So he takes him to court, and he takes his land back. So this guy's home gets completely annihilated, and he has to move away with his family to rent a really cheap apartment. But he lived in this nice house his whole life, and he just has to give it up because of this powerful businessman, which is, I think, really not fair. However, the sad thing is that before the house is destroyed and they go away, they're promised a settlement of money for his house, which is not very much at all. So they want to increase the price that he's going to get for his house, and so he's fighting this businessman. The businessman does not like it at all. Well, finally the house is destroyed and they have to move, but the wife, she gets very, very depressed, and so she commits suicide. Well, what happens is the husband, he goes through a lot of depression too, and the son is really sad. They're not really sure where they're gonna live and all this kind of thing. And the businessman looks at this as an opportunity to say, oh, I have an idea. I'm going to make it look like you killed your wife so that you will get in trouble, because I want you to learn a lesson that you should not mess with me, because he has the power, and he has the law on his side because he is powerful. Okay, so he frames the husband. He goes to prison for the murder of his wife. His son is now an orphan and homeless. And the businessmen and the lawyers and all the people of the government are happy they won and they took the land, and it's a celebration for them, and then the other half is really sadness. So this is another concept of modern rural criminality, and one that I think is not necessarily a reflection on all of the state of the villages today in Russia, but it's something that still happens, and this is why this movie was very controversial. But I strongly recommend it. It's called Leviathan. I'm sure you'll find it. So, Oberg writes about different crime in the Tlingit society and how the crime is classified there. There is 3 different clans: the Raven, the Wolf, and the Eagle. And these different clans hold a set of different powers. The power is determined by your territory, kind of political unity that you have, the amount of people in your clan, and of course the chiefs. Well, the Ravens and the Wolves are the most frequent and the biggest number, their clan. There's not many Eagles. So you can see, okay, the most power is probably given to the Ravens and the Wolves, and so they are going to be the ones controlling the land, they're going to be controlling the politics, and that also includes what kind of crimes are going to be punished in what way. And the chiefs, of course, are going to have that power. So there's a lot of murderers, adulterers, and thieves going free because the clans decided that they're just they were part of a higher society in the Tlingit society, so they don't have to pay for their crimes, or they get them paid off somehow. And a lot of times, if this is a case where the clan member decides, okay, he was my friend, or he had a lot of power, so we should just let him go and forget about this murder, there's going to be a war that follows. And the Tlingits are known for being more kind of aggressive and fighting style, rather than, the Aleutians or other groups of Native Alaskans. So I can really see how not only would they fight amongst other groups or other people, but they would also fight amongst themselves. So in many cases, these kind of horrendous crimes would just go off free because the clan members, the chiefs, had all the power, and they were the ones that would decide, depending on your social status, if you would be able to get away with these terrible crimes. So Burr, he talks about the end of apartheid. And what people were hoping for at the end of apartheid was this national democratic revolution where, freedoms and everything would be getting better and there'd be less fighting and everyone would be happy. But what it really created, and the way I think of it, is like a building being knocked down. So finally the mess is destroyed, but now you're left with all this rubble, so you have to get rid of it and construct something new. So what it really created at the end of apartheid was confusion. It created unemployment, social degradation. So all of these benefits and all of these great things in society, the people that were being prejudiced were hoping to achieve, was actually taken. There was less of it. And there's even violent death increases. So all these local problems, even including pregnancy, problems in the schools, theft, problems in the home, domestic violence, this was at an increase. And all of these kind of crimes were being pointed towards minority, or illegal immigrants, the young, those who were not disciplined, didn't have work experience, didn't have anywhere to go, gang members, and they believed that the community was being hindered by these groups. So interestingly, if anything, it seemed like the end of apartheid actually created an uproar of crime. And unfortunately, although a lot of these were just group related, where they had these they believed that these groups were hindering the community. Sometimes they were just groups. A lot of times they were certain races. So the racism aspect, even at the end of the apartheid, was still there. It created a revolution of sorts, and a democracy was forming to where there was more freedom for these people, but they had to start at ground zero, and in that case there was a lot of new crime that was able to be kind of taken in and determined, and overall probably helped with creating more crime laws, but at the same time they weren't anticipating this uproar that actually occurred at the end of apartheid. So my last topic is by O'Brien, and he talks about the historical problems of people that research criminology and try to classify different crimes, and what was the problems, back 100 years ago. So crimes produce criminal law. This can be a good thing because, okay, we look in the past at different crimes that happened and we can learn from our mistakes. But a problem is that these criminal laws can be based on crimes that they were horrendous or extreme things that happened, and they don't really apply or shouldn't apply to the general population. And so I think these laws can work both ways, and I think they should be tailored for every kind of situation. So anyhow, there's a lot of reference that these researchers in history have done through popular works, and although they contributed significantly to the idea of criminology in the way that they're studied today, the theoretical tools that were used to contribute to this historical work are a little primitive. And by that I mean they didn't have a lot to go on, and they didn't have a lot of formal research. They were just starting up, so of course it was going to be a little underdeveloped. And these popular works, although they were good, they were a little biased, I would say, because they're by different writers who perhaps had a certain perspective but weren't looking at something so objectively as they should have. There was also an increase of the rate of I'm sorry, it's difficult for me to pronounce this word, recidivism. And the failure of the penal system to rehabilitate its criminals. And this actually, in the end, created a class of hardened criminals. And these hardened criminals, angry against society, dangerous, rebelling, and the failure, it was a lot due to because they didn't really know how to deal with criminals in a way that in other topics and other studies people have had experience to look back and say, oh, I know how to take care of this problem. Well, they didn't have it. So this was a stage of development. It's kind of expected, and I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that they had to go through hard times to be able to learn how to deal with this kind of problem. But it's kind of inevitable when people don't have experience. There's a lot of experimentation, and that's kind of what O'Brien was talking about. So to review, we talked about the classification of crime and how crime is classified in different societies. Crime and madness, brigas, supermax prisons, how socially people are cut off, and this is a type of discipline. Rural criminality, which was studied mostly in Russian villages, or specifically by this paper that we were going over as one of our resources, how it's portrayed in cliquet society, how the end of apartheid actually created an upheaval of crime, and the different historical problems that have led to some of our uncertainties about how to classify crime today. So hope this was informative, and I'll show you my references cited here, and thank you for listening, and yeah, the end.